Okay, please welcome to the Douglas Coleman Show, Lawrence Jordan. Hi, Lawrence. How are you?
Hi, Douglas. Nice to be here.
Thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate it. What exactly is your title? Are you a filmmaker or a film editor?
Well, I'm a film editor, but being a film editor, you are a filmmaker.
Well, it's true.
So
yeah.
you make the film in post-production. You don't shoot it, but you are intimately involved in the process from the very beginning, through the very end. So although you're not on set, you're in regular contact with the director and, just sort of an advisor when, requested on anything that will make the film better or anything that's needed.
So on a film project, who is your boss? The director?
Yeah. In, motion pictures and television, you're hired by the director. Quite often the producers and even the studio will have a say, but your primary relationship is with the director. And that's the person you're going to be working with on a direct basis throughout the process.
So how much input do you have as far as what gets edited and what does not? Or are you just sort of told by the director, okay, cut this, change this, do this? Or do you have any creative input yourself?
Well, it's not as clear cut as either being completely creative or being totally told what to do. You discuss the script with the director before they shoot quite often, and get his ideas or her ideas about exactly what's going to what their vision is. And the film making process, again in motion pictures and television, is a multi-stage process. When the director is shooting, from my experience, they don't have a lot of time to come into the editing room and give a lot of feedback. Sometimes they do, but it's kind of rare these days because they're so busy on the set. So during that production phase, I'm hired to start working, the day they start shooting, sometimes, a week or so before or a couple of weeks before, depending on what kind of prep is needed and how complex the film is. And I will create what's called the editor's cut or the first cut, sometimes referred to as the first assembly, while they are shooting. I get the film from the previous day, each day, and I start editing the scenes. Now, sometimes you'll get a lot of input from the director. They'll be giving the script supervisor notes and indications of what his favorite or her favorite shots are. And then sometimes they don't communicate with the script supervisor at all, and your notes are non-existent. So, depending on depending on the person, you will have tremendous flexibility or less flexibility. During that initial production phase is usually, it's definitely one of the most creatively rewarding phases for an editor, because you really get to look at the film, have it speak to you, and sort of interpret what the director is trying to do and what the script is trying to say, and see what you come up with.
On your bio, it says that one of your first jobs was working on the film Terms of Endearment, which was a huge film in the day and won Academy Awards. What exactly did you do on that film?
Well, that, like you say, was one of my first projects. And the way it's structured in the Hollywood filmmaking process, and again the sort of larger scale filmmaking process, is that there's there's a guild system, and the editorial team, because you need a lot of people sometimes, is structured as such as there's a main film editor, and then there's a first assistant editor, and then there's sometimes a second. And then back in the film days, on Terms of Endearment, there was an apprentice editor which you don't see as much anymore because of digital technology, but that was shot on film. And as the apprentice editor, you're apprenticing to the editor and to the assistants, and you're really kind of like the low man on the totem pole. So I indeed was the low man on the totem pole on that film, and I did a lot of the sort of foundational chores and tasks that you did back in that day, like coding the film and sometimes syncing the film, labeling, creating a code book of the film so it can be tracked back to cut negative, and things of that sort. So it's sort of, I guess you could say it's the least creative of the post-production and editorial tasks. However, it has to be done right. And back in the film days, when things weren't done right, it cost a lot of money, and you couldn't just undo it on a computer. So things had to be done right, and you really sort of start to learn the workflow that is involved in the editing process, and you learned the additional skills that you would need further along the path from the other assistants and from the editor to a certain extent. Every situation was different. Some editors didn't communicate a lot with the apprentices. But some did. It just depended on the situation.
How much time and cost have been saved now with the digital technology? Because it seems like if you were to edit film, real film stock, that would be a pretty arduous task versus just, like you said, being able to go on a computer and just delete something or change the color of it or something, the texture of it or something. You can do it. Everything can be done digitally now.
Right, exactly. And the main cost savings is with the elimination of the analog film processing part. And, that was inexpensive to develop the film, to order additional prints when the film got torn or scratched, the film stock itself. So those are the major cost savings, in the digital world. Everybody shoots digitally pretty much these days, with a few exceptions. So you're recording onto memory cards. So that cost, which was a major cost, is completely eliminated. Now, conversely, what that has created is the ability for the production team, the director and the cinematographer, to shoot a tremendously larger amount of material. So from my experience, the cost savings from not having to process the film has been sort of taken up by the cost of just having to go through the huge volume of material that they shoot these days. But in general, it's really the processing. When you needed to duplicate a scene back in 35 millimeter film or 16, you would have to send it out to a laboratory. Now, of course, it's just Command D on the keyboard, and you've duplicated. You can duplicate an entire movie.
It certainly has revolutionized the industry, but when you look at the budgets on some of these films, it certainly hasn't made it any cheaper for people to make films, because we could put in inflation as part of that formula. But back in the day, I mean, $100 million was unheard of to make a film. Now it's pretty much the norm for a big, Marvel Comics type movie, even more than that.
Right, but what we have to consider is the volume and complexity and extent of visual effects, digital visual effects, which are now created, on almost every film, even from, small films that aren't quote unquote visual effects films, because every what we used to call opticals, dissolves and fades and transitions of that nature are done digitally. So really, you're paying for those hundreds of people that you see at the end of a credit roll that are, digitally manipulating the images, creating, digital characters and doing compositing and things like that. So that's where the budgets have, increased. Now, I'll disagree in the sense that if you're not making a visual effects intense film, you can do it quite cheaply these days with digital technology, cameras and editing systems. And, as is evidenced by the proliferation of films on the web and places like YouTube, etc., you can have a very, very small crew and you can make a film for a fraction of what it cost back in the film days.
Well, that's very true, because a lot of the indie filmmakers that I've interviewed have made great films that I've watched that, where the budgets were $50,000, $75,000. That would have been impossible back in the film days, 35 millimeter.
The original Halloween, for example, was made for $300,000, which was really considered a low-budget film. I forgot how much Spike Lee made She's Gotta Have It for, but that was made for a very small budget. There was a film by a director named Robert Townsend, and Keenan Ivory Wayans was involved in it called Hollywood Shuffle, for $100,000, and he financed it on his credit card. So, back in the day, you could make a low budget film, but if you've got the gear and you've got actors who are willing to, sort of participate in a project that is, micro budget, as they call it these days, you can make a feature film probably. Well, look at the first iteration of Paranormal Activity. I think that was shot for something like $15,000 or $25,000.
What about that film called Tangerine that the guy did all on his phone?
Yeah. You can shoot a feature film on an iPhone, unquestionably, and you can shoot it in 4K, and you can make a DCP, a digital cinema package, a master, and you can distribute it. And the avenues of distribution are much greater these days with streaming and the web. You can shoot it in 4K, and no one's really going to know the difference. Obviously, you don't have the kind of creative flexibility with coloring and grading, a film that's shot on an iPhone. But at the end of the day, man, it's really all about story. And if you've created an engaging story, people will forgive the technical limitations of the project. Well,
it's nice to hear that, because now I have nothing against the big Marvel comic franchise films. They're very entertaining. But I think there seems to be less focus put on the great stories. I don't know. Maybe I'm just getting old. But
no, yes, maybe we are just getting old. I'll agree with you there. So with getting old, we continue to desire for deeper and more complex, human stories and maybe alien stories. It doesn't matter, but we want to see complexity and
a story,
and
multi-personality
and stories. And I think those are popcorn movies, and those are big, what they call tentpole movies. And they're not so much concentrating on the story; they're more concentrating on creating spectacular visual effects that are going to, wow people and engage them in that respect. Yeah, I think we see less of that from the studios these days. I think occasionally, they'll pick up some films like that to sort of, keep respectability. But I think we're seeing that more from independents and smaller teams and smaller production entities and things like that. And then and that come not from traditional Hollywood, maybe from overseas and different things like that.
Well, it seems like the indie guys are still really doing good stories and a good script. And the big studios, I can make this comparison to music too, because it seems to me that all the really soulful singer-songwriter type music is now all indie. And the big mainstream Billboard stuff is the pop computer generated kind of music that just has lost the soul of the guy sitting on a stool with a guitar singing his heart out.
Right. Well, it's like any industrial complex. It's the entertainment industrial complex, and those giant corporations have to make films that perform, outstandingly at the box office and have global appeal. Like anything else, in the marketplace, when you're trying to, appeal to the largest global audience, you're going to have to sort of, most often, from my experience, you're going to have to kind of like appeal to a sort of lowest common denominator, so everyone gets on board. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but it's just to have the greatest mass appeal, because again, like you said, these films are outrageously expensive to produce, $100 million, $150, $200 million to produce. So they've got to, and then to market them is tremendously expensive. Sometimes that's an additional $50 or $100 million just to market them. So they have to make $1 billion at the box office, and that's what we're seeing now. And that's what major corporations do. But as filmmakers, there's a lot of artists out there who have something, a story to tell and have a unique voice. And that still resonates with people, smaller groups of people, maybe niches of people. But if the economics are right and you make the film for, the right price, you can still make money off of an independent film. And that's why we have a whole sort of, category of production companies and producers and people like that who make those kinds of films.
Okay. Well, I want to hit one or two of your talking points before we wrap up this interview. And a couple of them I really like. The first one said, do you really have to know somebody in the business to get anywhere? Is it possible to work your way up from the mailroom these days? What is your response to that?
The industry is made up of in Hollywood and the larger production centers. It's made up of guilds, and you had to get in the Editors Guild, so to speak. And back in the day, it was much more of, a quote unquote old boys network. And you really needed to know someone. Like, everything else in the industry, digital technology, changed all that. And not only editing, but cinematography and directing and things like that became accessible to so many more people. I mean, the kids these days, they've got, kind of rudimentary editing systems on their laptops in, elementary school. So everyone has sort of basic understanding of what the process is. Everyone has a digital camera on their phone. So the industry had to change, and obviously there's going to be resistance, but the fact of the matter is these days you don't really need to have a relative in the business anymore. Like 40 years ago when I started, you can set your sights on getting into the union. The editors union has become much easier to get into. I think it's a little more difficult still to get into the Cinematographers Guild. But, basically it's that kind of thing that you need a job. And if you get a job, you can get your days and then, put in an application to the Guild. You're eligible to work on $200 million movies if you'd like.
Okay, well, that being said, there's still be kind of a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, it might be easier to get in, but now you've got to compete with 50 million other people that weren't there before.
That's absolutely true. But I think, Douglas, that's true in almost every industry and every career path that newcomers are facing today. It's much more competitive these days. The markets have contracted. I mean, think about it, what it's like for directors, editors, even cinematographers to a certain extent. They're becoming commoditized. So, how does someone stand out? They have to work really hard, and they have to be really good at what they do. They make it.
All right, so the last thing I wanted to touch on is master the workflow. Tell us about that.
teaching has sort of always been a passion of mine, and not just teaching, but kind of like I'm one of these personalities who, when he's exposed to something that's really exciting, I love to tell other people about it and sort of see if they'll get excited about it. And digital editing, I was one of the first people to work on a film that was edited digitally about 25 years ago on the Avid Media Composer, which is the primary editing tool for professionals in Hollywood and and again the major production centers. About a couple of years ago, I was working with an assistant of mine, and we were talking about the catch-22 that we spoke about a little bit earlier. You need to know how the process works. You need to know the workflow to get a job. And unfortunately, you need a job to learn that workflow. You can get some bits and pieces in film school, but a lot of people learn by doing these days. They pick up a piece of software and they kind of teach themselves Adobe Premiere or Photoshop, what have you, and that's how they get their training. At the professional level, we felt there was a real need to teach the actual workflow, and not only the workflow, but the work environment of feature film and television editing. So Richard Sanchez and I decided to create a course. Lo and behold, we got 300 responses of people who were very interested in this in the first 48 hours.
Wow.
So it's really taken off, and we went and created the course. And we've been doing it for about 2 years now, and we've put over 400 people through it in over 35 countries. Our instinct that there were a lot of people out there who had the interest to learn the actual workflow, what goes on in a professional editing environment, was there. It's going really well. People continue to want to enter film editing and post-production. And Master the Workflow teaches all the steps on how to do that. It's broken up into 6 major modules and 32 lessons. It's over 14 hours of instruction. And we also have a private Facebook group where people can come and get support and feedback. And we really want to see people from all walks of life who want to be film editors have the opportunity to do that.
All right. Well, it sounds very interesting. Thank you so much for coming on the show. We do have to wrap this up. Where can people go to look for Master the Workflow in case they're interested in signing up for your course or they want more information?
Well, it's pretty straightforward. Mastertheworkflow.com is the place you should go if you have an interest in film editing or pursuing a career in post-production. And we're on Facebook. Just search Master the Workflow. We've got a public group, and we'll be happy to help you out.
Great. Lawrence, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was a real pleasure to talk to you. Best of luck with everything you're doing. Hope it all goes very well.
Thank you. Thank you, Douglas.